Okay, guys, good evening. Good evening. This is Jessie. I'm the liaison for the Special Needs Advisory Board of the Town of Miami Lakes. And welcome tonight to our meeting. We are here with NSU. Our presenters tonight are Christina and Ivan. And it fits perfectly with our mission, which is to promote a model town for inclusion for all people. And tonight we're going to be talking about the IEP, which is the Individual Education Plan that most of our students with disabilities or special needs have when in the school system. So Christina and Ivan are going to go ahead and take over and just explain a lot of amazing information as to what is an IEP and what to look for and the things that we need to know. So Christina and Ivan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Yesenia. So first of all, good evening to everyone. We're very happy to be here again with this continuation of the back to school trainings that we wanted to do in collaboration with the town of Miami Lakes. Both Christina and I are very thrilled to provide this information to all of you. We feel like specifically this training is going to go much more in depth into information that's very, very useful for families to take advantage of within their school system. And so we'll do it just like last time, where we'll go through our presentation, and then we'll have somebody monitor the questions. And then at the end of the presentation, we can go ahead and address many of those questions, okay? And then if you join us a little bit late, don't worry. Also, if you have other people that you know that want to join late, we will be recording this, and this will also be living in the Town of Miami Lakes website as well, on the Facebook page and some other pages. So you will be able to go back and watch this from the beginning. All right, so so before we get started, just to give you guys a little bit of an overview, both Christina and I have a little bit of background when it comes to the school system. Christina has quite a lot more than I do. I worked a little bit in private school setting and just a tiny bit in the public schools. But Christina does have quite some experience in the public school system. And so she has helped us develop this training, which a lot of people from parents to professionals to even staff from the school system have found it very useful to help them understand what this document really entails. And so what we're going to do throughout this presentation is that we're going to cover some different areas. And one of them is going to be IDEA. So we'll talk a little bit about that law and what it really entails and where it comes from. And then we'll get into what is the IEP and how is that different from a 504 plan. And many of you may have heard those two being mentioned before, and perhaps don't know which one to choose from, or you know, if one is better than the other. And so we'll get into the differences between them and why it's important to maybe sometimes even try and apply for both, depending on what you're looking for. And then obviously after that, we'll get much more in depth into our IEP. And so what are the different sections, and what is the idea behind it? What are we trying to cover in terms of academic goals, or, you know, social emotional goals, or even functional goals? And what are some of the accommodations that a student can have through this document? And like I mentioned before, at the end, we'll go ahead and answer any questions that you guys have. And so let's talk a little bit about IDEA. And so IDEA, or IDEA, it's essentially this law that it's a federal law that protects any student that has a disability within the public school system. And the reason why we were saying before that this training was intended for people within the public school system was because the IEP and IDEA only really applied to them. And so if you know anybody that perhaps is enrolling in private school, this information might be useful for them in the future if they make a switch, but it wouldn't necessarily apply to them today. And so IDEA stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it was first passed in 1975. And the main thing that it really taps into is that it tries to provide a free and appropriate public education to children with disabilities. That's what we call FAPE. And so IDEA really tries to, the mission is for schools to have to abide by providing a public education to children with disabilities. So whenever you're having, let's say, issues in terms of the resources available in the school or the placement that's being offered somewhere, IDEA is what helps families be able to perhaps, let's say, come to an agreement with the system as to what some other options they may be offered for them, even if it's not at their home school. The idea really is to give parents a voice in their child's education. So IDEA also, one of the things that it brings up is that when you create this IEP, when you have this meeting, it's supposed to be a team meeting. And so what we want to do is to make sure that not only the input from, let's say, a psychologist is being taken into consideration or a speech pathologist, but also the teachers, as also the parents, and in some cases, let's say after age 14, even the student itself. And these are things that many families are not aware of. And so part of this process is really trying to bring on board what is the input that the family has? What do they want? What are they trying to get out of this education? And so who qualifies for IDEA? There are many different diagnoses that would make you qualify for this, or later we'll notice that under the IEP that will be considered to be eligibilities. You know, it could be autism, deafblindness, and the list goes on and on. You know, for instance, many of you may have children that have an ADHD diagnosis that will fall under other health impairment. It could also be some, you know, orthopedic impairments, or it can be a specific learning disabilities. So it could be things like dyslexia, you know, or any other learning issues. It could also be things like a traumatic brain injury. And so really, as you can see, it's not really necessarily just tied to, let's say, a learning disability or a physical disability, but rather any type of disability that's getting in the way of the child's education. And so the criteria for determining if somebody is going to be able to receive services under IDEA is that they have to have a disability, and as a result of that disability, they need special education in order to make progress. Now, this is an important thing that we wanted to touch upon at the beginning of the presentation, because you may have a child, or you may know of somebody, maybe a family member or a peer that has a child that perhaps has some sort of disability, whether it's mild or not, that doesn't necessarily get in the way of them making progress in school. So somebody can have, for instance, an ADHD diagnosis and may never need special education at all. So this is why it's important to point this out, because it has to be that the disability requires this person to get special education in order to make progress within their curriculum. And so let's talk a little bit about the IEP versus the 504 plan. And we have a chart that goes a little bit in depth as to what the differences are. But I would like to tell a story before we get into a lot of these things. Just a heads up, a lot of the families that are probably tuning in have at some point tried to apply for a McKay scholarship or want to do it. If, let's say, they're coming from a private school to a public school, we usually recommend for families to try and get a 504 plan while they're waiting for their IEP process to be completed. And so one of the requirements for the McKay scholarship is that you need to have a certain amount of time within the school year where you're receiving some sort of accommodation. And so that would either mean that you have an IEP or that you have a 504 plan. And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people, for instance, may start a school year, and throughout that school year, it may take them on to, let's say, the spring for them to get an IEP, and then they're no longer deemed eligible for McKay scholarship at the end of that year. Whereas if they begin with a 504 plan while they're waiting for all the evaluation process and for that IEP to be developed, then they do have a chance to qualify and potentially maybe be able to transfer to another school within the district that maybe has better resources for them.
Sorry, Ivan, and to add to that, so besides the McKay, an important part of also, let's say, like Ivan said, you have a child or you know of a child that starts school in September or in August, and they don't get an IEP until the spring. That's a very long time for that child to be in a school because they're going to be placed at their grade level. So it's a very long time for that child to be at their school without any sorts of accommodation. So while the 504, and Ivan will get into that, is not as specific in terms of goals and things like that, the 504 will still provide some accommodations and modifications within the school, within the classroom and within the setting that will help your child or the child that you know to be able to at least have some accommodations in the time that they get the IEP in place. So it helps with the McKay, and it also helps for the child to be accessing the curriculum as well as possible with those accommodations within that time.
Thank you, Christy. And so when looking at the IEP versus the 504, one of them, so the IEP is going to be through the IDA law that we mentioned before, whereas the 504 is going to be a Section 504, which is through the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So the 504 was really brought up as a federal civil rights law to stop discrimination against people with disabilities. And it came about a little bit before IDA did. Whereas the IDA and the IEP is really through, the purpose of providing special education for people with disabilities. So we're looking at two different things, but for purposes of being able to access certain services or qualify for certain assistances, then the 504 is sort of like a bit of a gateway to get there in the meantime. It is not a substitution for an IEP though, because it will not have all the areas and all the academic parts that the IEP has. And so like I was saying, if you look here, so the IEP on one side, it's a plan for the child's special education experience at school. The 504 plan is really going to be a plan on how the child will have access to learning at school. So let's say, for instance, if you have a child that maybe has an accident where they fall and they have to put it on a cast, then they can get a 504 plan to address that accommodation in the meantime. That wouldn't deem them eligible for getting an IEP and falling under IDEA. And so as you go on, you'll notice some of the other also differences that are listed in here. But essentially, just to reiterate, the main thing is that the IEP is going to really focus on the academic and the special education experience, whereas the 504 plan is really just temporary accommodations for a lot of the students, and then for some other ones, just accommodations that they need without having to really have to do anything with special education. And so let's talk a little bit about the IEP. And so the IEP is going to have many, many parts, and it can be very overwhelming. I can explain you that, at least even for myself, from my own personal experience, it has taken me many years to understand the different parts of it and kind of have a sense of what I should be looking at in all of these sections. So what we're going to try to do today is try to go over them a little bit more in depth, just to hopefully give you an idea of what does each section means. And what we'll do is that we'll try to go through each one of these sections also in order, so that if you want to look again at this training later on while you have your IEP in hand, you can kind of go over it, and while looking at it, seeing and understanding what each actual section really entails. And so before we talk about the parts of the IEP, we need to talk about who are the required participants. And so in order to have an IEP meeting, the following people need to be present. The local educational agency or LEA representative. This can be, let's say, if you have a sped share in the school, that would probably be your LA representative. Or if a school doesn't have a sped share, then it could be somebody like, let's say, like the assistant principal. So it's not always necessarily going to be the person with the same role within the school. This is going to vary from school to school. Then you're going to have also a general education teacher, if it applies, a special education teacher. And for students that are over 14 or will be over 14, you would also be required for them to not necessarily be part of the entire meeting, but they do have to be brought into the meeting and they do need to sign that they were present. A lot of times, students are brought up to be asked questions about how they want to address certain maybe challenges that they have. And then for areas where like maybe you're talking about the deficits that someone has, or you're pointing out things that are a little bit more negative, then you usually excuse the student because you don't want to also attack their dignity, if you will. So usually they're not present throughout the entire meeting. And then obviously the parents are required to participate as well. So without any of these individuals present, you really cannot conduct an IEP meeting. Usually throughout the IEP meeting, some of the other people that are brought in that can be invited, let's say as a therapist or speech therapist, OT that sometimes have feedback, a school psychologist, those people can be invited to the meeting, they can participate, and then they tend to be excused before the meeting is done. And so let's talk about some of the key components. The first part is going to be the educational placement. So when you're looking at your IEP, first thing you're going to see after you have the information on your school and the student and all of that is going to be the educational placement. So that's going to be referring to what type of class is a student going to be in. Is it going to be a general education class? Is it going to be a special education class? So let's say a resource room. Is it going to be an inclusion class? Is it going to be a self-contained class? Is it going to be a combination of these things? That will be specified there in the educational placement. In Broward County Public Schools and the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, this will be on the cover page. So right in the front, like I said, right below the information on the student and the school and all of that. Then the next thing that you're going to see is going to be your program eligibility. And so this is going to be in reference to the documentation that has been provided to the school as to whether somebody has a disability or not. It doesn't have to be a primary disability. So let's say if somebody has multiple diagnoses, they can submit documentation of this. And if by so it's determined that this different diagnoses have an effect and have an impact on their access to their education, then they can be listed as an eligibility and used as a way to access more resources through the school system. The next part that's going to come up is going to be the curriculum decisions. This is a very important area because oftentimes there's a lot of confusion when it comes to standard curriculum versus modified curriculum. In order to qualify for a modified curriculum, you have to have an intellectual disability and fall below the IQ of 70. Now, many of you may know, or some of you may not be aware that ASD, so autism, is actually not a cognitive disability. And so it doesn't automatically qualify you in order for you to have access to a modified curriculum. Oftentimes, when we're looking at students that perhaps would benefit from having a modified curriculum, we try to ask for parents to look into any documentation, prior testing or anything like that where perhaps it was mentioned that they fell under IND or an intellectual disability. If, for instance, somebody is right about the cutoff score for that mark, then you can also try and request further testing. A lot of families don't know that within the school system, you can request for testing at least every 3 years, but you can request for testing even more often than that. And so if it's ever in doubt that a student may qualify for modified curriculums because they're so close to the IQ that they need to be, then we can present that to the school and see if that's an option. In terms of accommodations, you're going to have different things. So for instance, accommodations are going to be cues to stay on task. So this can be, any sort of, let's call them any sort of environmental cues that are present. And so it can be stuff like maybe presenting the work in a specific way where the letters are maybe bigger or bolded, highlighted, or it can be having visual supports within their desk or the classroom to kind of assist with that. It can be also verbal encouragement. It can be, for instance, being able to use certain manipulatives to access the curriculum. And so it really looks in many different ways. We have students that perhaps need somebody to read a test for them because their reading skill is not up to the level that it needs to be for them to do testing, but maybe they do know the content of what they're working on. So if you have any doubts about this area, please reach out to us. We actually have a list of a whole bunch of accommodations that are possible, and we're more than happy to share that with you. I know that just to think of them off the top of your head might be a little difficult. So we're more than happy to give you ideas as to what those accommodations might look like. And then you can sort of explore whether or not they would be a good fit for your child.
Yeah, so, and just to add to that too, so if you, and I know we're talking mostly about the IEP, but if on your child's IEP, it says under accommodations that their work tasks are broken down into smaller tasks, or that they have extended time to complete assignments. So those things also apply or should apply to iReady. For example, if you're at home and they're having a very hard time completing a lengthy lesson of iReady, those things should apply there too. And also if your child is currently doing virtual learning, the accommodations on their IEP should apply to that as well. So you can keep that in mind, and it's always a good conversation to have with your child's teacher if you feel that those maybe accommodations are or are not being met for your child. The other thing that I wanted to just quickly mention is if your child is on a modified curriculum, or if they're going to be placed on one, you also are going to be given a form to consent to that. So you're going to have a conversation. In general, if that's being recommended, it's probably the best bet for your child, but you do have a choice as to whether you want to agree to that or not. And you will be asked to sign a form at the beginning and every single time after that you have an IEP or any sort of formal meeting like that.
So the next area that we're going to talk about is going to be the assistive technology. And one of the things that we're always trying to get across to people in general, not just to parents and professionals, but even people in the community, is that assistive technology doesn't necessarily mean something that's totally modern. And so it can really be any item, that can be, a piece of equipment or a software program, but it could also be anything just as simple as a visual item, like something that you printed out and it serves a purpose. That could be a technology. And so we're always trying to express that because, for instance, many of the students that, especially that we work with that have an autism diagnosis, they may benefit from having a communication system. So a picture exchange communication system. And that is considered to be a technology. It's a low technology because it doesn't necessarily have to be implemented through a tablet or anything like that, but it serves the same purpose. And so this is important for you to know for two reasons. So one of them is that just because your child may not be very good with, let's say, modern equipment like a tablet, or maybe if they have a lot of frustration and you're afraid they're going to break that, or the school's afraid that they're going to break that, then the low technology could be an option. But also, just because we want to make sure that if something like that you want to implement it, it is included and listed under that IEP. And so just because it's low tech, it shouldn't really escape that assistive technology area, because that's what's really going to guarantee that that's being implemented within the classroom. And so, like I was saying, some other examples could be, even like a pencil holder can be a low tech technology. And then in terms of the high tech, obviously, it can be a special purpose computer. It can be a head tracker. So it really depends on what it is that the student needs. There's actually, there's an evaluation that the school does just specific for assistive technology that can be requested. They have a process. But also there's a place called FAST, which is an organization. And if you guys need that information, we're more than happy to share it with you, where a lot of you can go and you can loan a device and try it out and see if it's something that your child will respond to. They also have a lot of trainings where they can teach you how to implement some of these technologies, so that also they're more successful. So it's not only that your child is accessing something through the school system, but also you're being able to implement that at home as well, so that it has the best outcome possible.
Yeah, and Ivan brings up a good point. It should be, so for example, a person in, let's say you're using something for communication or something to be able to write or whatever it is. Think about it this way. There are times where those things, they try to limit it to only certain parts of the day. But for example, a person who needs a wheelchair needs it throughout the entire day, right? And that works the same way for a person that's using a communication device, because they may not be able to use their voice to communicate. So they need either, whether it's something low tech like a communication board or an iPad or whatever it is, it can't be limited to one part of the day. They have to have it consistently throughout the day. They should be able to take it home. They should be able to use it at all times of the day to be able to communicate, because in essence, it's their voice, right? So that's really, really important. And then throughout in the school system, you can request for your child to have something called an ATIP, which is an assistive technology and individualized plan. And then they are able to, the same sort of thing that FAST does, they're able to sort of do a checklist to see in what areas they need it. And then they start at the student's instructional level and they start implementing things to see what works best. And then once that's completed, it becomes part of that child's repertoire of strategies or technology that they're using.
Now, the next things that we're going to talk about are going to be, for instance, the assessment decisions. And so depending on the level of your child, you're going to have the option of having him be on an FSA, so the standard curriculum, or an FSAA, which is for the modified curriculum. In terms of the specialized instruction, this is an area where it lists where the student is going to receive each single service and how long are they going to receive it for. So like, for instance, if the student is going to receive speech and language therapy, then it's going to say, okay, the student is going to receive speech and language therapy in the let's say general ed classroom for 30 minutes twice a week or something like that. So it's going to be this chart where you're going to have laid out all the different services that this, every student is going to receive in the different types of settings as well. Then you're also going to have the related, so the related services as well. And perhaps I'm getting confused here, Christy. Please jump in if I am, because now I'm maybe visually not looking at the page quite well.
So before, when you were talking about program eligibility, that's why that's really important. Because, for example, if a child has a diagnosis of a language or a communication impairment, let's say a language impairment, and they have that under program eligibility, then they're required for that to be part of their specialized instruction. So that would go there. Now, if they don't have that, but they still require some assistance in communication, then speech and language therapy would go under related services. As far as specialized instruction, this has to do with where their goals are going to be addressed. So for example, if you have a student that math is at grade level and is part of the general education classroom, then they would be assigned math instruction in the general ed classroom. But let's say that same student needs a resource room for language arts or reading or another subject, then under specialized instruction is where you would see where that child is getting each of their services, right? And then related services is more occupational therapy, speech therapy, language therapy, and physical therapy. And then right there is where it says what therapies you're having under related services, and then the frequency, so how often they're having that. And that also relates to if they're just on consultation, if they're on collaboration, and if they're receiving direct therapy.
Thank you, Christy, for clarifying that. Then you're going to have the assurances or special considerations. And so in this area, you're going to have mentioned whether a student is on assistive technology and what that assistive technology is going to be looking like, whether there is a behavior intervention plan. And so when was this, implemented? If there was any data collected, when was the data collected? And then also the communication needs. So does the student need any language therapy or any services as part of their basic stuff in order to be able to access their education? In terms of the transportation, you're going to have a couple different options for the transportation. Most students usually go on the regular bus, but some students may require a little bit more assistance. So they may go on a special transportation where they get picked up from the front of their house as opposed to the bus stop. And in some cases, they may even have a special seat where they're seated and they have, like a different seating area just to make sure that they're safer and they have their own space. Just to guarantee their safety. There's usually somebody else in the bus also to be taking care of the student when they need more assistance as well.
So I can go over this a little bit. So this section, this is actually a copy of one of the pages on the IEP where it shows the educational services. And what happens here is we see that there's a lot of times confusion in this because there's a lot of sentences that look very, very similar, and there may be like one key word that makes it different. So I'll explain what I mean. So for example, between assistance for the majority of learning activities as opposed to ongoing continuous assistance for participation in learning activities. So what the first one implies is that it's for the majority of activities, but not all of them. So, and then the second one where it says ongoing and continuous means all day, every day, all day for all of the activities. So if you have a student that needs help, let's say for like the core subjects, but in other subjects, they don't really need a lot of assistance, then you would maybe pick assistance for the majority. But if you have a child or a student that they need to be continuously assisted the entire day for every activity, then you would pick that. Same thing for, let's say, physical safety is another one that many parents understandably are concerned about. So here, for example, here both of them are elected. So supervision to ensure physical safety during the majority of activities, as opposed to continuous supervision to ensure physical safety. Now, if you have a child that needs to be monitored or that needs to be, watched the entire day due to physical safety, meaning you're concerned about them putting inedible objects in their mouth, you're concerned about elopement, self-injury, stuff like that, you're gonna, like, those are major things, and you're definitely gonna want to have continuous supervision to ensure physical safety. The majority of the day could be, the difference there could be that occasionally there's been a history of like elopement, you know, things like that. This is also where you would put if your child requires catheterization or tube feeding or anything like that. This is where that would go. And it's very important for these things to be on here, because you're gonna, if your child has a new teacher, if there is a substitute, you're gonna want for that person to come directly to this page and be able to understand what it is that that in a nutshell, what it is that your child needs, right? If they need to, if let's say the sped chair needs, your child goes to a new school, the sped chair gets the IEP, you're gonna want for them to be able to see this. And if they do have these health needs, you're going to want for them to address that with the nurse or whatever healthcare worker there is in the school. So these are things that there's little subtle differences, but it's really, really important for them to have this for that. And also this is the area, or one of the areas that generates the McKay, not the McKay, I'm sorry, that
the matrix score.
Matrix score. Thank you, Ivan. This is what generates the matrix score, or helps with that. So it's really important for everything that we just mentioned for that to be on there. And then also up top, it says indicate participation in non-academic or extracurricular activities with general education students. So this is also super important for, you know, for a lot of families. If you want your child to go to the cafeteria and have meals with the general education students, you want them to participate in athletics and recess and in assemblies, that's where you would put that up there and check those off. So this section is actually often overseen, but it's overlooked, I'm sorry, but it's a very important section. So I recommend that you guys look through this, and if you have any questions, that you reach out either to your teacher directly, to your school, or you can reach out to either Ivan or I, or your case manager at heart.
And so in terms of the goals, you know, goals can be a bit tricky, and oftentimes when we're reviewing IEPs, we notice that the goals are not necessarily written in the most effective way. And so one good way to think about what you need to consider is this acronym SMART. So goals should be SMART in the sense that they should be specific, they should be measurable, they should also be attainable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It should be result-oriented and then time-bound. And so what we mean by specific is that the goal should really specify how you're going to get to the goal. So it's not enough if, let's say, I'm just mentioning that the student will be able to read 10 words that start with the letter C. Because you're not really specifying how the student will be able to read these words. Are they going to be able to read them off a tablet? Are they going to be able to read them with assistance? And so these are going to be little things that are going to be the difference in not only determining that these goals are implemented in a way that they're more effective, but also that the people that are working with the student can all be on the same page. The other thing that you want to be able to do is to be able to measure this goal. So you want to be able to have a sense of how much am I accomplishing my goal? How am I reaching? At what point am I getting to the effectiveness that I want in terms of this skill? Do I want the student to be able to do this on its own by, on his own or her own by 80% of the time? Do I want the student to be able to do this 85% of the time? It really depends. We could say 100% of the time, but the truth is that there's always room for mistakes. So we have to, this is where also, you have to be realistic in terms of how the goals are set. And so you want to make sure that they're attainable. Goals are typically meant to be met within the school year, and they should be typically separated into, let's say, 2 or 3 benchmarks, so that, let's say, by mid-year or so, you can have a sense of whether or not you're making progress with these benchmarks. The good thing about this is that, let's say, even if you have a goal that perhaps wasn't able to be completed to its full capacity within the school year, you did meet the benchmarks, which means that when you go again and you review the IEP, you know exactly which changes you need to make when you're rewriting the goal. If, let's say, for instance, you have a goal that wasn't met at all, then you have to review whether or not the student even has the ability to be able to perform that goal, or if you're maybe not delivering the way you're teaching the skill in the most appropriate way. So usually goals that are not met within the school year are meant to be changed. This is another thing that we don't like to see within IEPs, is when the goals are just sort of recycled and repeated over and over and over. The other part about the goals is that usually when you're getting into every single area, you're going to notice that there's, at the top, it says the strength of the students and the effects of the disability. And we always want to make sure that the strengths of the students reflect what the student can do on their own. A lot of times when I say that, people will, tell me, well, Ivan, the issue is that, this person may not have the ability to do a lot of things on their own, but everybody has the ability to do at least something. And so sometimes, the student's strengths can be to follow a one-step instruction. Maybe it is to stay seated when you're doing work, even if they can't do the work by themselves. And that's already a prerequisite for them to access their education. Another strength could be that maybe they can do stuff, maybe not fully independent because they need a visual support or something like that, but maybe they don't necessarily need the teacher to be there telling them what to do, which is exactly what we want to see in terms of a strength. A strength is something that we feel the student can do independently and can be generalized to other areas. Otherwise, if we're just teaching things and we're deciding that these are things that have been mastered and their strengths, but they cannot be done without the presence of a teacher, then we might not see any progress later on when the student moves from, let's say, the school to the university or something like that. And then there's another part where we talk about the effects of the disability. And so when we mention how the disability impacts the student in this academic area, then we want to make sure that our goals reflect those challenges. So our goals should be directly tied to whatever challenges the student has in this area, and should always be like that up until the point where, again, the goals are met, they're put in as strengths, and then we can look to see what other effects the disability has at that point. So these aren't things that are necessarily going to stay the same all the time, which is why we have those yearly meetings and why you even have the ability to do an interim IEP meeting in between that year if need be. Some cases you might have a student that maybe makes a lot of progress. Maybe the goals were written and we didn't know how much potential the student had at that point. And that would be great if we had to go ahead 6 months later and review an IEP and write new goals. But in general, the goals should be written to reflect the areas of deficit, summarized in the affects of the disability.
Yeah, and one other thing that I wanted to bring up. So, for example, if you have a student that has or your child has a difficult time communicating verbally, even let's say their wants and needs, right? That attainable part means that we're not gonna, like, if that's already something that's difficult for them, let's say in another section where it has related to feelings, another area where they struggle with, right? We're not gonna put that where they're gonna verbally identify their feelings, because now we're adding two things together that are difficult for them and putting it in one goal, and that in its own is going to make that goal not attainable. So communication would be a separate goal. It would be, you would work on whatever skills they need to be able to request your wants and needs separately. And when it comes to that feelings goal, it could be pictures, it could be dolls that have different, or whatever you have in the classroom, or they have in the classroom that has different let's say like affects or expressions or whatever, but it's not a verbal, they don't have to be verbal or talk about it, right? It would be two separate things. We always have to be very conscious when we're writing these goals that we're not we're not adding two things together or a lot of things together that are going to be very difficult for that child, right? So we have to make sure that attainable part is really, it's all important, but that attainable part for our students is very, very, very crucial. It's crucial for us to remember that. And then if you as a parent, or if you're tuning in and you're a teacher and you see there's nothing, we all set goals. I, as a teacher, I've created things that I thought are beautiful lesson plans, and then they haven't been, right? So we all come together as a team, we create a goal, and we think it's going to be great, and we think the child's going to we think how we're going to approach it is going to be great. And then when we start working on it, we might see 2 months in that we're not really making any progress. So it's fine to say, you know what, let's have an interim. Let's discuss how we can rework this goal, how we can figure out, different ways to target this in order to be able to help that child be successful. And as parents, my recommendation is that you're open to that. Because at the end, what you want is for your child to be successful. Like, there really shouldn't, we try to recommend to everybody to kind of let go of like that ego part and make sure that we're all working towards the betterment of the students, right? So if it isn't working, meet again, come up with a goal so that we don't have to spend a year working on something that is not gonna be attainable. Meet 2 months in, discuss it, do an interim, change it, and then move forward.
Yeah, and like Christy was saying, those goals might look different for different students. And so you might have students that even potentially might be working on things that are more community-based, things that maybe are going to be more beneficial for them later on when they have a job or something like that. They might not look so academically inclined, but they're still very important. And so at some points also, you might have to maybe revise and decide, do I want to keep going this route where this person's not being necessarily too successful, or do I want to focus on the things that are really going to be meaningful in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years? So that's just something for your families to think about as well. And so the goals are going to be spread around 5 key areas. So it's going to be the curriculum and learning. And so this is where you're going to have things like, let's say, language, if you're working on any language skills, reading skills. You're also, any math or anything like that, you're going to have those goals listed in that first area. Then when you move into social and emotional, if you have any sort of skills that you're trying to build that maybe are tied to, socialization, or maybe even, to the DIP. So if somebody has a hard time expressing that they're frustrated, so maybe they should have a goal within their social and emotional area where they should be working on how to express more properly frustration. So it can look very different for each student in this area. And this might be one of the areas that might be changing the most often, if you will, because you might be meeting targets right away, and then something else might come up where you have another skill deficit that you need to address because you might be getting in the way of the education. Then you have the independent functioning. So you're going to look at, skills like how, it depends on the level of the student, what you're trying to do, but is the student able to maybe, pick up their book and follow instructions? Is the student able to look at how much homework they have and turn in their homework? These are very important skills. These are skills that are going to be necessary no matter what route you take in life later on. So it's important to try and address those through the IEP. Like we were trying to say, it's not only the academics, it's really being able to do all these things on your own. Then you have the healthcare, so if the student needs anything like any medicine that they take or anything like that, you can try and address those goals through there. Even when you're talking about, you can think about a million examples of things that students, you may want them to be able to do, like, even make sure that they are following proper hygiene or things like that. And then obviously the communication. So we want to make sure that the student is able to advocate for themselves, and they're able to express what do they need or how do they feel in a certain moment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, about how important it is for students to be able to advocate for themselves as they keep getting older and older. And so, like we were saying, the curriculum and learning will tackle the academic goals that are targeted. And we gave some examples of those when we're talking about what the goals should look like. And then in terms of the social and emotional, we're going to be talking about behavioral skills and behavioral management. And again, this can be very, very different for each student, but it's important. And I was actually having this conversation with Christy not too long ago, that a lot of times you're going to notice that in the strength of the student, it's mentioned that they're able to do certain things, and yet in their effect later on in other areas, it's going to be mentioned that they're lacking certain behavioral skills that are going to get in the way of them accessing everything else that they're trying to do in their IEP. The independent functioning, like we mentioned, is going to be any type of daily living skills. So in some cases, it can be things like even, being able to do laundry, or being able to, fold your clothes or things like that. So depending on the level of the student, the independent functioning can look very, very, very different. Or even just having on-task behavior. Are you able to sit down on your own and stay on task for a certain amount of time without having to depend on somebody telling you to stay there?
Yeah, and these two areas in general are areas that I think, we go into these meetings, and it's not that the other things are not important, but many times there's a very big focus on curriculum and learning and communication, which again are really important key areas. That's why all of these are here, right? But for some of our students, for some of our children, if the social and emotional goals, those conforming behavioral skills, the staying on task, if those things are not addressed, and if we don't have goals and interventions and appropriate strategies for them, it's going to be hard, if not almost impossible, to be able to get to the point where they reach those curriculum and learning goals, where they reach those communication goals, right? Because if you have a child that has a very difficult time staying on task, if we have a child that really has a hard time just following through with simple instructions, whether it's because they have a difficulty understanding the instructions within that independent functioning, or because it's more of a behavioral issue. If we have those sort of barriers, and we don't have any strategies in place that are really, really strong for those students, it's gonna be really difficult for them to be able to sit down and, let's say, read a few sentences and then be able to be on task long enough to answer the questions, or to be able to do a more difficult math problem, things like that. So that's why all of these things really come together, and it's important to have sort of like that equal time to concentrate on all of these areas, right? And we normally don't see it, but they are. These are really, really important key areas. And like I said, if you guys ever have questions about this, you can always reach out to us. And we can give you really specific examples, or we can review your child's IEP and give you some feedback. If you're a teacher and you have questions on how to create some of these goals or need some ideas for strategies, we're also happy to assist as well.
And then, like we mentioned before, then you also have the healthcare. So any needs that need to be addressed. Whether it's taking like I said, a medication at a certain time, or having if somebody has a condition, let's say, by which they need to maybe go to the bathroom more often or anything like that, those can be mentioned in there and they can be addressed through there. And then in terms of communication, what are we going to have in terms of the language goals, therapy, or any collaboration or consultation. So remember that in some cases, some of these therapies can be embedded into the classroom. So it's not always going to look the same. It's not always that a student is going to be pulled out and taken away to do a therapy session for speech or something like that. Sometimes they may have a pulling session where, you know, the therapist comes in and they have to work on stuff within the class while the class is being directed. So, you know, how to participate, how to raise your hand, how to wait for your turn and things like this. These are things that if they're explicitly put as goals on their communication, then you can have the support of the therapist and have them come in and assist you with this. And so here we're going to talk about what happens when the students get over the age of 14. And I mentioned before that self-advocacy was going to be a very, very important part of the IEP goals, because we want our students to have a voice, just like anyone else. We want them to be able to express what are their needs, what are their challenges, what makes them happy, and all these things, not only when we're present, but also when we are not present. The self-advocacy goal is going to become sort of the main focus as you're trying to move the students and transition them now into high school years and then potentially into, let's say, college. And you're going to notice that more often than not, the students that have stronger self-advocacy skills are going to be the ones that are going to be a little bit more successful, whether it's at a, you know, any type of college setting, whether it's a technical college, a community college, or even just having a job, a volunteer job, because they're able to they're going to be able to express how they best work. And so we always try to explain to families and to professionals that there's a big difference between, let's say, not being able to do something and, let's say, coming with a problem and saying, well, I just can't do that. Then coming up to somebody in a proactive way and being, you know, I have these limitations, but this is how I deal with them. And so if you're able to accommodate for me in this type of ways, then I can perform for you at 100%. And that's what we want for them. We want them to be able to ask for clarification if they need to, you know, any explanation, or for them to, you know, to be able to request for things to be explained to them in a different way, whether it's visually, they need to see things in a visual way because that's how they learn, whatever it may be. Then the next thing that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to when they reach that age is going to be the self-determination goal. And so this is going to be, and it looks sometimes a little bit similar to the self-advocacy, but it's a little different in the sense that this is really more about trying to define this person's personality. What is it that they want? What is it that they enjoy doing? How would they go about doing these things? And so you're teaching them these skills on, okay, you want to work, let's say, in construction. Okay, so what would you do? How would you go about that? Let's say, you know, how are you going to be able to get that job? And what do you need to do? Do you need to do an interview? Do you need to create a resume? So there's a whole section, and again, we can share this with you about what are some of these goals that we can work on. Within the school system, obviously, some of these goals may even be related to the IEP. So some of the examples that we mentioned are like, you know, how to practice maybe a mock IEP meeting so that they learn what does that process look like? How do they go about it? You know, and maybe even how to request these meetings. Because the only way for them to become more and more successful at this is for them to practice the more, you know, the most that they can.
Yeah, and I think another important point to make with the self-advocacy, because it's something that we've seen a lot, is where the goal in general is we'll ask for help when needed. But we all know, or some of us, right? Like it took me, I was telling Ivan, that it took me really like a while to understand the difference between self-advocacy and self-determination and these, you know, these things. But when it comes to self-advocacy, it's more than just asking for help, right? So for example, if let's say a student starts in a community college or in a university, and they have to go, like it's their responsibility, right, to go up to the professor. And if, let's say, they are they have issues with their vision and they need to sit, let's say, in the front, or they need to sit in a specific seat, then it's their responsibility, right, to inform that to their professor, or it's their responsibility to go to their college or university's what the office that they would have to go to and ask for whatever accommodations they need. So it's really about getting them to start to understand how to advocate for themselves, how to advocate for their needs. So not just help when you need it, but also, you know, like these are like, just be more explicit about what it is that they need. And that's not necessarily, you know, talking about their disability or whatever different needs that they have, but it's more about like understanding that in order for me to be successful in this setting, in this job, in this classroom, in this, you know, whatever it is, this is what I need. And I need to learn how to identify that. And then I need to learn how to communicate that in the most either professional or in the best manner for the situation, right? And I think, you know, for the most part, for parents, we try to get them to start thinking about that from earlier, even before they're 14. But for this in the school system, where they really start to bring in the students to make these decisions is if they, like Ivan said, if during that IEP, they're going to turn 14 or starting from their 14th birthday on, they should be part of these decisions. And the same thing for self-determination in the school system. Ivan and I have actually practiced it with teenagers that we work with. They have an entire checklist that you go through and you kind of go through it. And it's a very, you know, it doesn't seem like you're rating yourself, but you are. Like, can you identify your address? Do you like working outdoors? Do you like, and it sort of starts giving them an idea of like, oh, these are the things that I still need to learn. These are the things that I like. These are the things that I don't like. And it helps them to start to shift and understand, oh, I'm really great at this. I need some work on this. I like this. I don't like this. And then that helps them to start to determine sort of where to like the path of what they want to be doing, whether it's college, university, technical school, going to work, starting to do something to volunteer, like those kind of things. And that's where the self-determination really comes in.
I think that, Christy, you mentioned a very important point, and it was that you said that it really doesn't necessarily have to do with disclosing a disability.
Right.
And that's why these two goals are so important, because you're really tapping into having skills that are good for anyone, regardless of whether or not they have a disabling condition. And when you give somebody those skills, you're really setting them apart from the rest of their peers. And that's really what we want to do. How do we make these students so much more prepared than their peers, which maybe even are neurotypical, but don't have access to this type of programming because they don't necessarily qualify for it under IDEA. And so we want to tap into and maximize this as much as possible. And then the next part is going to be the procedural safeguards. So many of you may have noticed that when you're having your IEP meetings, they always talk about the procedural safeguards. And so these are basically rights that are intended to ensure that all the parents have the opportunity to be partners in the educational decisions and that they're made regarding their children. And so usually throughout the meeting, this will be brought up, and they will ask the parent, did you get a copy of the procedural safeguards? Were you able to look at them? You understand them? And then the parent will have to say, yes, I did, I consent. I understand what my rights are. So this is something that's always going to be shared, whether it's physically, if you're having a meeting in person, or whether it's electronically, if you're doing a Zoom IEP meeting these days. But they will always share this with you every single meeting. That's correct, right, Christy? For everyone meeting.
They're gonna what they're gonna do is they should be sharing a copy of this with you once a year. So at least once every calendar year, you should be getting a copy of the procedural safeguards. And I believe you have to sign off on that as well. And then something that I forgot to mention, or that we forgot to include here, is if you speak, or if you know of somebody that speaks another language, they also, so the language, the meeting, should be conducted in the parents, if they request it, in the parent's primary language. So if they don't understand English, the meeting, there should be an interpreter there that will help to explain or will help to translate in the person's or in the family's first language. And then the procedural safeguards, I do believe, are already interpreted into Spanish and Creole. And otherwise, you could ask within your school to see how they could be explained in your first language as well. Sorry, I forgot to mention that before.
And so some very important things that we want to cover. Parents will always have to consent to initial and all screening and evaluations. So this is something that a lot of parents find out later on after they realize that they have requested for something, let's say an evaluation of any type, and then they realize that they don't hear back from the school and nothing happened. And then we ask them, did you sign consent for that process to be started? And then they're like, oh no, I did not receive anything. And so it is very important that not only do you request for something, a screening or an evaluation to be started, but that you sign consent for it. The only way that the 30 calendar days that are listed there for the school to have to comply with these evaluations and the screenings is for you to have signed that consent form. Otherwise, those days don't count at all. And so you could be sitting there for 6 months, and if nothing was signed, it's like you never requested anything. The other thing that parents will always have to consent to as well is any change of services or placement. Now, what this means is that for a lot of parents, sometimes they're told to sign something, they're brought into the office and they're told, hey, can you please sign this for me? And maybe they're running around because maybe they have, a couple kids and they have to go back to work or whatever, and they don't necessarily look at what they're signing. So we always advise parents to take your time, not necessarily sign things right away until you really understand what it is that you're signing also. You don't want to then look back and realize that maybe you consented for your child to be changed to a different type of classroom that you didn't necessarily agree with at the time. And so those are, they don't happen all the time, but we have heard of cases of things going down like that. And so we would like to avoid parents a bit of a headache by giving this type of advice to them.
Yeah, so this, I don't know if this is still referred to it as that, but it's called a FAPE form. So in order for, like Ivan said, in order for there to be any screening, any evaluation of any kind, whether it's initial or any other one, parents do have to sign off on that and approve for those things to move forward. And then the other thing is, for example, if your child is receiving occupational therapy and the therapist decides that they no longer feel that the therapy needs to be in place for that child. So the therapist cannot make that decision on their own. That is, they would have to do an evaluation. And then based on that evaluation, there would have to be a meeting, and the entire multidisciplinary team, meaning the people that we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, the special ed teacher, gen ed, the parents, and the LEA, and the therapist, they would have to meet. The therapist would have to present the results of that evaluation. And then as a team, everybody would have to decide whether to either decrease, increase, change in any way, or remove from services. But at the end of it, the parents would have to consent for any change of services. So if you decide that you are not in agreement, you do not have to sign that. And you can, the school does have, or the school could potentially argue that, and there may be more steps that come after that, but you do not have to sign something just because if you are not in agreement. And another thing that Ivan and I discussed before was this, again, this is a legal document that is in place for 1 calendar year. So if in order for that to go into place, all parties have to agree. So parents have to sign, they have to consent for it. So if there's something that you're not sure about, when you're doing that IEP, you can say, in the most, it doesn't have to be like a combative sort of thing, but you can say, I really want my card case manager to review the draft of this IEP. I want to show it to my therapist because I want to get a second opinion. I want to hear from them based on their knowledge of my child, what their input is. They weren't able to make it. However you want to word it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that there's an issue, because it's probably these are also, expert people and people who know your child well, potentially. And, and it doesn't have to be like that there's an issue with the IEP, but maybe you just want clarity from somebody that you work with more closely, and you say, could you please email me a copy of this draft? I really want my card case manager to look at it. And then, if you have any questions that you feel, maybe just weren't answered within that meeting, we could potentially answer those for you, and then give you clarity as far as what what's on there. And then, for us, what we also like to sort of put in as a disclaimer is we're going to review it and we're going to give feedback based on what we feel is most appropriate for the child that we're discussing, for the child that the IEP was done for. It may agree with one side, it may agree with the other, it may agree with both, but we're always going to go at it from the side of the child. Like, we're not going to be advocating for the teacher, we're not going to be advocating for the parents. We're going to be giving our opinion or our professional judgment based on what we feel is best for the child in question.
Yeah, and I think, Christy, that it's important to point out that now that we're having these meetings virtually, if you request for a copy of the document, it doesn't mean that you're not already consenting for it to be closed. And so you have to specify as a parent that you want to leave it as a draft for you to review, rather than just saying like, okay, we finalized the meeting and you're closing the IEP. This is an important aspect too of the times that we're living in right now. Go ahead, Christy, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just agreeing.
No, I was gonna tap into the notes section, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself because I don't remember if we have a part for it here.
We don't.
Okay, so given that now we're going through all the situation with the pandemic and whatnot, oftentimes there's sometimes disagreement on whether or not the notes section of an IEP can be useful or not. But I think this would be a great time to exemplify how, for instance, if you were trying to request something in an IEP meeting right prior to the pandemic, and you were given some sort of timeline or some sort of reason as to why something couldn't be implemented or done right then and there. If you put it in the notes section, when you have your next IEP, you can go back and you can show, look, this wasn't met and we understand it was because of a pandemic, but this is what we wanted at that time and where we were. This was going to be our next step. If you don't write certain things into the notes section, it's a little bit harder to show maybe where you were at before. And so things can always happen, families can move, a parent can get a job somewhere else, go into a different school. And if you don't have certain things in writing, it's a little bit more difficult to show that you were headed into that direction.
Right. And also, one other thing that I've come across as a teacher in the past, or as there's times where parents, they want to give they maybe have some concerns, some behavioral concerns, or some just overall concerns that maybe don't fit really in any other part of the IEP. So that note section, and maybe it's something like a behavioral concern that the teacher or at the school that is not, or the child is not exhibiting in the school setting, and that's fine. And because they're not exhibiting that, let's say like if it's elopement, or if it's like I mentioned before, putting something putting in edibles in their mouth, like that kind of thing. You're not going to write a goal for it because they're not seeing it in school, but it's still, a major concern for the parents. So because of that, that is something that can also be added to that note section, so that, everybody that could potentially be working with that child is aware of that. So that's also a good point to make. I think with this, we are done. Ivan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
No, I think I'm good on my end. I would like to know if there are any questions for sure. But before we get into that, let's wanted to share our contact information. Like we mentioned before, we're very happy to assist. You know, we at CARD, we have a lot of families registered with us, so we have to be honest. We don't necessarily go into IEP meetings with families. It is not one of the services that we advertise or that we get funding from the state for. But we are here to help families, and we can review an IEP, which is why we recommend for families to maybe sometimes take their draft home, send it to us, and let us have a second look at it with fresh eyes. And we're more than happy to do that. You know, if you don't remember who your CARD clinician is, you can reach out to us and we can let you know who it is or assign you a new case manager. If you're not registered with us, you can call us and register with us, even if it's just for this purpose. We're here to assist in many ways, and our services are continuing, will always be free for the community. The other thing that we wanted to share with you was, well, actually, we're not doing the evaluation, right, Christy?
No, we don't.
Okay. Yeah. So we're not. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else, Christy, before we open it up for.
Yeah,
questions.
just so for anybody out there, because I know that we're live on different platforms. So if you're not registered with us, we are the University of Miami Nova Southeastern University Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. You can reach us at any of these numbers, or you can scan with your phone camera the QR code, and it'll take you to our pre-registration page where you can fill that out. And then basically what we do is we just provide support and guidance for families of individuals with autism or related disabilities, or if the individuals are adults, to them as well. We help people across the lifespan. So from whenever they're diagnosed well into adulthood, we provide training such as this one. We provide recommendations for our families. And then if you do want to register with us, you call one of these numbers. You will be assigned or you'll be scheduled for an intake with one of the case managers at CARD. We'll take all of your information, give you recommendations based on whatever needs you have, and we'll continue supporting you that way. Like I said, we also do trainings, we have support groups, and we have on our website, you can also sign up for our newsletter, and then you'll be able to receive 2 emails a week. One that's going to have information on the activities that we're doing through CARD, and another one that is just some general community activities. And then with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and anybody that has any questions, we will be happy to answer them.
I didn't see any questions on the chat or Facebook. The only thing I noticed on Facebook was in regards to the assistive technology accommodation in the school system. Does that continue to college as an accommodation, or does it end in high school?
So all of the accommodations that they have, so that's why we mentioned how the advocacy is so important, because while they're in the public school system, even if they are into the, even they're within that 18 to 22 range, as long as they're still in the public school system, they will be continuing to receive whatever services they have. Now, if they transfer into a college or job or some other system, they would have to get the assistive technology from another place. So wherever they're going would provide that, they would have to ask at the disability office there, or like Ivan mentioned, they could also contact FAST, which is FAAST.
Yeah, and so essentially IDEA will not go beyond the 22 years of age of being enrolled in the public school system. After that, you're sort of like bit on your own, which is why it is so important, like Christy said, to try to tap into these resources as much as possible. Sometimes we even recommend for some families to not graduate as soon as the child's 18, because maybe they can benefit from a little bit more of these services, even if they're going to school just like part-time and they're also having a job or something like that.
I do believe, I mean, again, I don't know, it's not gonna be maybe as specific as this, but for sure, you know, there has to be ADA offices in the colleges and the universities and stuff like that, that would help with, you know, with maybe the assistive technology, or that would help with whatever other needs or accommodations they have.
Absolutely. So the help does continue, whether it's through the Disability Services office in the colleges, as well as the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. So there are services out there still available after high school. So I want to thank you guys. Thank you to Christine and Ivan with Card and everyone involved for this very informative information. I want to encourage our residents of the town of Miami Lakes to visit the Town of Miami Lakes website, where you will find a resource page, which includes NSU card, along with other great resources as it pertains to services available and resources available to individuals with special needs throughout the community. And if you have any questions, we will definitely have NSU card listed there, and you can always reach out to myself as part of as the liaison of the Special Needs Advisory Board of the Town of Miami Lakes. So with that, if there's nothing else, then I would like to say thank you, and good night to everybody, and stay warm.
Thank you.